Avengers Endgame. It's so beyond difficult for me to talk about this movie, given just the massive curve that you have to grade this movie on. Because, again, taking into consideration the fact that this absolutely was the finale / send-off that the MCU had deserved and earned. Not to mention the fact that out of the 3 massive, game-changing, gigantic franchise finales that we got in 2019, this was the only one that didn't suck. And in terms of giving us as fans, who had sat through movie after movie after movie after movie and dedicated hours of our life to this franchise, in terms of that sense, this movie worked 1000%. Upon rewatch as a movie though, unfortunately, I do have to slide into that camp of asshole in that Infinity War is the better movie. Because again, while the last hour of this movie is one of the greatest finales I've ever seen, the first 2 hours leave a little bit to be desired. And I'm not even gonna go so far as to say that this movie is a bad movie. Not at all. If anything, the thing that's most impressive about this movie to me is how it deals with grief. Because like we've seen a lot of darker superhero movies that deal with more mature themes, you know, your Logans, your Jokers. But what was so fascinating to me is how the movie uses kind of the bait and switch of the first couple of minutes in order to lead into the first act, which is basically making the leftovers of the MCU, in terms of showing how all these heroes that we've come to know and love are suffering from all this existential grief that came about as a result of the event at the end of the last movie. And showing just the growth and change that these characters went through in that first hour alone, to me, was more growth and change than I had seen in most of the last couple of movies. Like, the thing that I enjoyed so much upon seeing this in hindsight is seeing how, very similar to the parts that I loved about Age of Ultron, the actions that were determined by each one of the original 6 Avengers would determine the path that they would go on and set up their arcs for the rest of the movie. How it does that, especially given with one of the 6, that's a different story. But at the very least, unlike Infinity War, which was very much Thanos' movie, and even more so unlike the first Avengers, because the first Avengers, Hawkeye really didn't have that much to do. This movie really was about wrapping up and giving us the finale to the original 6. Or at least that's how it was pitched. Because while seeing Iron Man make the sacrifice play, Cap finally get the happy ending that was taken from him, Thor finally accept who he is amongst dealing with depression, Black Widow making the sacrifice play in order to do what she could for her adopted family, and Hawkeye reconciling with his actions post the snap. Why is it that when that Hulk's entire arc happens off screen and he's relegated to jokey supporting character number 3? Like, don't get me wrong, the MCU is known for its jokey supporting characters, and it really kills me that once again, Rhodey, but not only him, but Rocket have nothing to do in this movie. But Hulk? Really? Who's proven to be one of the most dynamic and interesting characters in the entire MCU? You put his entire arc off screen and you just make him another jokey supporting character? That killed me, especially given that I would even go so far as to say he actually did have something interesting to do in the last 2 movies. Like, for the most part, they actually did have an interesting arc with the continuing Hulk story with Ragnarok and Infinity War, and then Endgame kind of just dropped the ball. And the thing is that I'm not gonna completely blame Endgame for that, because there was supposed to be a deleted scene at the end of Infinity War that showed him reconciling with Hulk and then the 2 of them become Smart Hulk. But to me, it would have been so much more interesting if he had actually had to deal with the conflict of still blowing up at any moment, in addition to now having finally found peace. And now for my biggest problem, that being the actual time heist. I don't mind the idea for it. As an idea in terms of providing a voyeur to pay homage to the MCU, it's a great idea. But how it's executed, both from a technical standpoint and just from my own personal standpoint, I don't think is done very well. Because again, how this movie pulls a lot from Age of Ultron, but how it could have swapped a thing or two, is Age of Ultron, as much as I love seeing the team together, that movie, I feel like it would have been much better situated if they had each had to go off on their own. And in this movie, because this is the first time that you're seeing the original 6 together since Age of Ultron, because remember, Hawkeye wasn't in Infinity War, and for a majority of the movie of Infinity War, the Avengers are still split up. To me, this would have been the movie, seeing them having to go through time and tackle this stuff as a team together again, rather than splitting up. That, I think, is a missed opportunity. But also, from a technical standpoint, again, the 3-hour time span did not bug me at all the first couple times that I saw this. But on this rewatch, oh man, this movie dragged. Like, don't get me wrong, there is some great stuff in that time heist. The Rene Russo stuff, the stuff with Tony's dad, the great payoffs of both of the first Avengers and Winter Soldier in the New York sequences, the entire Vormir section with Black Widow and Hawkeye is one of my favorite parts of that movie. But I still feel like it could have been paced a little bit better, and there should have been just a little bit more stakes involved. Like, I hate to be that guy that complains about time travel in movies, because you can basically make up your own rules to what you want. But it almost stumbled into a little bit of a lost problem where they were trying to make it happen both ways. Where they said that nothing mattered, but the stuff that they did in the time heist very clearly does matter. It's just not going to be resolved in this movie. It's going to be resolved in future things. The problem is, at least for a lot of this movie, this is the finale. So, you know, you should deal with that stuff. But the scene where Loki steals the Tesseract and creates the branch from the 2012 timeline, to me, that should have come back and bit them. And to me, I get that this wasn't the version of time travel that they were going for, but to me, there should have been a version where Tony Stark did actually have to risk losing his daughter in order to save everyone. I know he expressly said at the beginning that he wasn't going to do it if that was a risk, but like, to me, that would have been way more intense, especially for this movie. It's so funny because for the longest time, I was willing to excuse so much of the MCU's skeeving of darker materials in order to forgive them for the finale. But this is the finale. And to me, this is not the time to be light, especially given that they are now attempting to undo what was effectively the darkest timeline. Like, the stakes should be ultimately even higher here. And Thanos in this movie, I don't mind it being the old Thanos. If anything, I actually think that's an ingenious idea. And also, in execution within the world itself, it kind of makes sense that this is the Thanos that they would beat, because they already showed that they couldn't beat the Thanos in Infinity War. So the idea of bringing back old Thanos for them to beat, again, is an ingenious idea. But I do have to be on the side that I feel like because there's so much of this movie where Thanos isn't in, I do have to agree with the idea that the minute that they pierce the barrier and they touch down on Morag, and again, this is mostly just like a pacing thing, Thanos should have been on them and following them throughout the quantum realm. And I feel like that should have been a big thing in the second act rather than just saving that for the big finale for the third act. And it's so funny because, again, I always attribute these as sounding like nitpicks, but in hindsight, it does kill me a little bit that of all the other MCU movies that I'm willing to excuse their problems for, this is the finale. So this should be their best one. And the fact that this does, unfortunately, fulfill the ultimate cinematic cliche of being the Return of the Jedi to The Empire Strikes Back, where the second installment is so dark and so in your face that the third one has to be almost like excessively light in order to recompensate. Like, I don't get that. I'm not a huge fan of it, and I wish that studios would stop doing that. Like, the reason to me why Return of the King is the best Lord of the Rings movie is because it takes everything that Two Towers did amazingly and ups the ante. Dark Knight Rises had a little bit of a trick because nobody was ever going to top the Joker. But to me, Toy Story 3, why that works is because that takes everything that Toy Story 2 did and ups the ante. And this does, in a sense, but it doesn't go all the way. Because the story isn't as tight and there are a lot of extra moments that don't feel as earned and necessary towards the plot, it does unfortunately make this feel more like a greatest hits album than an excellent movie. This is still a 4.5 out of 5 stars for me. And again, in terms of the last hour and in terms of this being a finale for the MCU, great. Couldn't ask for anything better. But as a movie, unfortunately, this isn't my favorite MCU movie anymore. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Going into this movie, the only thought in my head at the time was, okay, how are they gonna top the first one? I know that's never anything that you should think when you're going into a sequel, especially for a new franchise, but alas, I've been on the internet at that time. It was a thought on my head. Because since that movie, we'd already had a second Avengers movie and a Civil War. It had been 3 years since the first movie, and I was like, okay, what have you got for me, Volume 2? And in a lot of senses, it was better than the first one. But as you can tell by the ranking on this list, unfortunately, I am still a Volume 1 guy. Which is just to show you the power that this micro-franchise within the greater MCU has had, because within 2 movies, it already seemed to fracture the massive fan base that it had garnered into either Volume 1 or Volume 2 camp. I personally am a Volume 1 guy. I've heard the arguments from the Volume 2 camp, and I understand where they're coming from, but Volume 1 is still a tighter movie for me. But Volume 2? Oh man, for as sloppy as this movie was, and it was a sloppy movie, there were jokes, emotions, filmmaking techniques, visuals, gags, and just a whole lot of insanity that I was not expecting from a Marvel movie or just from a movie in general. It's a common trend that I've seen across a lot of MCU movies that the first one always has to be very self-contained and very studio-oriented. And it's funny because I usually tend to end up liking those movies more because they're usually the scripts and the stories are just tighter. I'm a Volume 1 over a Volume 2 guy. I'm an Ant-Man over an Ant-Man and the Wasp guy. I'm an Iron Man over an Iron Man 2 guy. The only time where I actually liked the sequel better than the first one was Winter Soldier over First Avenger, but that's only because of the director change there. But yeah, the Guardians of the Galaxy movies has always been, even before like Infinity War and Endgame, they were known as those movies back when like it was popular. There was that subsection of the fan base that hated Marvel to be like, oh, the Guardians of the Galaxy movies are the only ones that feel like they were made by a filmmaker, not a committee, which again, I've already stated my thoughts on that train of thought. But there really is something to be said about that argument because the way that James Gunn directs both of these movies, he really does add a level of love and care for these characters that to me, no other director in the MCU has added to the characters that they've had to direct. And if Volume 1 was Gunn contained, then Volume 2 is him on full blast. Like, I literally don't know what more I can say about this movie than I've already said. This movie is a friggin' just blast. It's a crazy galaxy hopping adventure. They add even more worlds to the first one. They go even more bombastic with the ridiculous characterizations that they have. The performances from almost the entire cast are arguably better than they were in the first one. Because the thing about this movie is that because besides the actors being more comfortable with the characters that they're playing, it's one of the few MCU sequels that for a second can actually take a backseat from the plot of the MCU in order to focus on the characters. Because this movie is basically a sitcom in terms of how it focuses on the character interactions and lets that drive the story. But that being said, this is still a movie and there are still themes and there are still stakes and a plot that is happening. It's just so subliminal for the most part that you don't even realize that it's happening until it is. And it's so funny because the first couple times I saw that, it's what turned me off about the movie. But once I actually realized that that's what the movie was building to the whole time, it really did make this movie even better. Because the movie to me does the smart play with not announcing the villain first and foremost. Even though you can pretty much kind of tell that Ego's gonna be a villain, just based on his power and his scale alone. But how they characterize him and how they introduce him, it really is to me the first example of Marvel finally getting a villain right. Like, I liked Ultron and I liked Zemo, but they were more so personal choices. But in terms of being the first widely recognized, well-liked Marvel villain, then it was definitely Ego. And how Quill struggled with his father and how that theme kind of spread out and encompassed all the rest of the Guardians, it really was ingeniously handled in my mind. And the thing that kills me, that absolutely kills me, were the criticisms that, oh, this movie thought it was a lot funnier than it really was. In a lot of senses, yeah, the humor in the first movie was better. It's part of the reason why I like the first one better. But the thing about this movie is that this movie really tapped into something the first one really only hinted at, which is just how damaged each and every single one of these characters are. Like, the first one, you really only got hints into each one of them because they still had to introduce them and get you to like them. But in this movie, they really break down just how fractured and messed up these characters are and really how much they need each other. Like, it's so funny, yeah, Drax doesn't have that much to do, but his interactions with Mantis and just that beautiful little moment where he's describing how he reminds her of his wife and daughter and how innocent they were is tear-jerking. And the stuff with Gamora and Nebula, even though it really is kind of its own subplot, it's still fantastic. And also with my favorite subplot in the movie, that being the relationship between Rocket and Yondu, and how they relate to each other by constantly feeling like they're outsiders and that they use their humor and their assholish natures in order to cover up the fact that they feel like they'll never actually fit in. It really is one of the few examples of taking a very, very, very personal struggle and enmeshing it in all of this outlandish, crazy nonsense. And even though I still like the soundtrack in Volume 1 better, the soundtrack in this movie is, to me, 1,000 times more unique. And it kills me that Baby Driver had to come out only a few months later, because to me, this is the soundtrack of the year. Like, they're going with Lakeshore Drive and Wham Bam and Cat Stevens, and the way they use the chain, oh my god. Because that song is basically the entire crux of the theme of this movie. If you don't love me now, then you'll never love me again. I can still hear you saying that we'll never break the chain. It is literally all about how Ego is coming in and how Quill is understanding that his dad never really loved him, but how he's not gonna let his dad's lack of love for him affect the relationship that he has formed with his new family. This movie's great. It really sucks to me that, like, there's no such thing as a perfect Marvel movie, but this really is as close as it gets. 4.5 out of 5 stars.
Alright guys, that was my latest ranking of my MCU rankings list. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to click the like button and the subscribe button. Follow Talkin TV on all our other links. We're on Facebook and Instagram. The links are in the description below, and be sure to keep coming back for more quality content such as this. Have fun, stay safe, and as always, watch more fucking movies.